in.
And
Here we go. Admit all. Here we go. And I'm going to quickly start off now. Right. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Brothers and sisters, welcome to the Islamic Courses Zoom session titled Book Review Discussion Defending Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam in Modernity with author. Very privileged to have Dr. SherAli Tareen, Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Franklin and Marshall College at the US of A. And this session is hosted by our dear friend and Ustad Maulana Dr. Haroon Sidat from the research, who's a research associate at the Center for the Study of Islam at Cardiff University. Before I hand it over to Maulana Saab and Dr. SherAli Khan, just a quick reminder to everyone, housekeeping rules. Keep your PCs and Macs on mute or whatever device you have, number one. Number two, it is being recorded. So if you're not on our mailing list or if you're not registered for this, please leave your email with this. And finally, there is a Q&A session. There is a Q&A session where you have a chance to write down your questions on the chat or ask directly to the presenter. Very important reminder, it is an academic platform, so we want to keep the questions relevant to the subject and discourse, and most importantly, high quality questions, please. If you haven't read the book, fine. If you have read the book, excellent. You'll get a great opportunity to ask questions. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Maulana Saab. Bismillah, Maulana.
Okay, assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not going to talk too much. I'm going to dive into the book because there's a lot of things I want to explore with our guest today. I have a lot of questions, and I'm sure you will do. There's two things I want to achieve. Number one is to try and squeeze as much as I can out of our author. And number two is give him as much opportunity as we can to as he can to talk about his book. There's a lot to be said. Just before we go into the book, I just want to quickly give you an overview of the book, and he will, inshallah, go into more detail with you. So the book was published in 2019. It was awarded the American Institute of Pakistan Studies Book Prize in 2020. It is the most comprehensive and theoretically engaging work to date in terms of what's arguably the most long-running, complex, contentious dispute in modern Islam, the Barelvī-Deobandī polemic. And I mean, there's a lot of discussion around the normativity of the Prophet. One of the things I found really interesting in the book, and I'm sure the author will go into it, is deconstructing this binary that we are often dealing with as academics and scholars writing about Islam in the West. So I'm going to welcome our author, Dr. SherAli Tareen. Thank you for giving us your time. The first question I really want to ask is just to sort of introduce the book is if you can tell us about your journey, your interest in South Asian Islam, and how you came to this idea of writing this particular book, please. Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, thank you so much to Maulana Dr. Haroon and Mizan and to all of you for this really kind invitation. I know this is sort of a link which can circulate anywhere in the world, but I'm especially thrilled that I got this invitation from you because really the UK, as I was writing this book, the UK is a very key context for me in terms of the audience for this book. So that is particularly heartening when I received your invitation. So in some ways, as I say in the book also, especially in the postscript right towards the end, when I bring in my own positionality a bit, that, you know, I am from South Asia, from Pakistan, of course, marked as a South Asian Muslim. But as I write in that postscript, that this is a tradition that I write about in this book, the Muslim intellectual traditions of South Asia, the ulama tradition, is something that had almost escaped me growing up in that country, going through this, this tripartite education system of the sort of English medium private schooling, and then of course the public schooling primarily in Urdu, and then of course the whole religious madrasa system and so on. And this tripartite or schooling system really has had some major psychological consequences in terms of the relationship between the larger society with this whole tradition, this really important, complex and rich heritage of Islam in South Asia and of course elsewhere also. So my interest really developed when I started reading about these figures and these texts, and it really, what I found curious was how I had escaped this whole tradition. how I really, these names that I then have now written this 400-page book about, I had not even heard of these names, Maulana SherAli Tareen, Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan, Haji Imdadullah Muhajir Makki, and so on. So really it was a curiosity of this particular tradition and its depth and its complexity on the one hand. And on the other hand, what I noticed as I began my graduate studies at Duke University, where I studied under the tutelage of Professor Ibrahim Musa and other major scholars of South Asian Islam, Dr. Bruce Lawrence, Dr. Carl Ernst, and so on, that the way in which these discourses and these traditions and their debates were often talked about was often either superficial or stereotypical. Stereotypical in the sense of, as I write throughout the book, and especially in the introduction, that oftentimes when we look at these intra-ulama debates and contestations, they're looked at from these binary perspectives, especially when it comes to the whole Deobandī-Barelvī debate that we'll get into in a moment. It is oftentimes looked at as this debate between the banner bearers of Islamic law or some kind of harsh Puritanism that is often associated with the Durban School. And then on the other hand, some kind of mysticism or mystical inclusivism that is often associated with the Barelvī school. That this is some kind of a debate between guardians of Islamic law or the Sharia, and on the other hand, those who are followers of Sufism, and hence they are okay with practices like celebration of the Prophet's birthday or visitation of the shrines of saints and so on. So this binary that I call the law-Sufism binary is oftentimes the very sort of dominant way in which this debate is thought about, not only in terms of its popular perception in South Asia and elsewhere, but even in some very serious academic works, we see this kind of a binary at work, and I show many examples in the book itself. Now, this binary, I argue, is part of a larger binary, which is a much more insidious discourse on Islam and Muslims, which is the good Muslim, bad Muslim. And the idea that when you look at intra-Muslim debates and contestations, that they have to follow the same template that some kind of a modern Western notion of what good religion is or what bad religion is has to follow. So to look at these internal Muslim contestations through the template and through the prism of this dominant modern Western, and in today's world, what I would call this kind of a new imperial Euro-American way of looking at elsewhere, this other world of Islam, where these debates among Muslims have to follow this kind of a template where you have the good Muslims who are good, mystical, inclusive types, or you have the bad Muslims who are the Sharia-minded Puritans and so on. And that's how this debate has been looked at, especially in the post-9/11 world, where many of these think tanks in Washington, D.C., that's how they looked at the Barelvī-Deobandī debate. Hence, you had this whole move to, for example, establish quote-unquote Sufi universities in places like Pakistan, with the assumption being that this will lead to a more mystical and more inclusive and a more good Islam, which can then be counteracted or can be presented as a counterweight to this kind of a legally oriented Puritan Islam of the Deobandis. With the result that oftentimes these kinds of measures, this kind of imperial measures backfire, in that prophetic love reached a level that, today when we look at these debates around blasphemy and so on in places like Pakistan, that whole imperial push to intervene in an indigenous debate and to look at it from one's own imperial standpoint has spectacularly backfired. So anyways, I'm just presenting the larger politics, the larger sort of political intervention that this project makes. In a nutshell, what I try to do, and I would, of course, want to hear your questions, that's more important. In a nutshell, what I've tried to do is present the nuances, the complexities, and the details of this intellectual tradition by focusing on the thought, the texts, the debates, and contestations of some of the most influential modern Sunni ulama of South Asia in the late 18th century and then the entirety of the 19th century. So the scholars who populate this book include Maulana Shah Waliullah Rahmatullah alayh, and then in the early 19th century, his grandson, Maulana Shah Ismail Shaheed, as he is often called, or Maulana Muhammad, Shah Muhammad Ismail, and then his key opponent, Maulana Fazl-e-Haq Khairabadi. So these were the two major kind of trends of thought in South Asian Islam, the Waliullah school or the Waliullah family, and then the Khairabadi family and school. These are overlapping networks. They have a lot in common also, but then they also have a lot of contestations that I try to capture. So the first half of the book focuses on this early 19th century context, this late 18th and early 19th century context, by looking at this debate between these two scholars, Shah Muhammad Ismail and Fazl-e Khairabadi. And then it moves to the late 19th century, and it shows how these individual debates among Muslim scholars in South Asia eventually take on a much more group-centered orientation. As South Asian Muslim scholars get divided into these competing normative orientations, what I call, or what the term is, masalik or singular maslak. And the two major masalik, of course, or normative orientations are those of the Deoband School and the Barelvī School. And there I focus on the thought of the pioneers of these schools, Maulana Rashid Ahmad Gangohi, Maulana SherAli Tareen, and then Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan, the founder of the Barelvī School. And then finally, the third part of the book looks at intra-Deobandi tensions and intra-Deobandi sort of conversations by looking at the relationship, this very fascinating, rich and productive relationship, but which had its own interesting tensions between the Sufi master of the Deoband pioneers, Haji Imdadullah Muhajir Makki, and his disciples. So it looks at their texts of all these scholars in Arabic, in Persian, in Urdu. I wanted to really make a case that, you know, Arabic and Persian are also important parts of the South Asian ulama tradition, and their contributions to these debates. And primarily, the last thing I would say is just to clarify to your listeners and to your viewers why this book is called Defending Muhammad, peace be upon him, in Modernity. The reason being that as I was researching this book, I realized that a lot of the debates that we see among these scholars had to do with the persona of the Prophet, had to do with the question of how we should think about the Prophet in these new conditions of colonial modernity when Muslims have lost their political sovereignty after the end of the Mughal Empire. So a lot of the debates that I write about prophetic intercession or shafa'a, or this whole idea of heretical innovation or bid'ah, or this idea of the Prophet's knowledge of the unknown or ilmul ghaib, or this idea of can there be a second prophet or not, imkan al-nadhir, or this idea can God renege on his own promise or not, which is called imkan al-kizb. So the question that became important for me then was, why are these debates happening at this time? Why do they take, I mean, these are much longer debates in Muslim history. They have a much longer history beyond South Asia also. But why do they become so intense, so intensely debated come the late 18th and then 19th century? And the answer that I came up to that question is that the context of these debates is the loss of Muslim political sovereignty. As you have centuries of Muslim political rule coming to an end in South Asia, for Muslim scholars, the key question became, how do we now preserve our tradition in these difficult conditions of colonial modernity? And each of these scholars then begin to think about the question of divine sovereignty. So the whole question of the book is, as a community loses its political sovereignty, how does that shift the focus of attention to the question of divine sovereignty? And then its relationship to prophetic authority, the Prophet's persona, the Prophet's charisma, the Prophet's authority, and the conduct of everyday life among the masses, or the ritual life of the masses. So that's basically the conceptual interrelationship that I explore throughout the book, the relationship between divine sovereignty, prophetic authority, and the practice of everyday ritual life, what I call theology, law, and practice, or God, prophet, and community, this triumvirate relationship between the three. And that's basically what I call competing political theologies. So the whole idea of political theology is the relationship, the intimacy between theology and politics, and the whole question of, as Muslims lose their political sovereignty, how does that shift the focus to the question of divine sovereignty and its relationship to prophetic authority and the practice of everyday life? So that's the main argument of the book, that the Barelvī-Deobandī polemic, rather than looking at it as some kind of a polemic between law and Sufism, or, you know, inclusivism and exclusivism, or moderate and extremists, what really is happening when you look at the internal logics, when you read their texts closely, is that this is a polemic about competing political theologies. And if you read this polemic and its depth, there is tremendous nuances involved that we should really take into account to look at the heritage and the complex heritage of South Asian Islam. So that's in a nutshell what this book is about.
Thank you. Excellent. So one of the first questions I want to ask is, you talked about ambiguity and sort of this idea of binaries, the problem of binaries. And one of the key actors that you've mentioned is Shah Ismail, Muhammad Ismail, and how often in the book, he's often portrayed as a person who just went out for jihad, is sort of a jihad warrior, but we often miss out on his political theory, for example, that you talk about in the book. I wonder if you could talk about him a little bit and how he interacted with Fazl Khairabadi and sort of the tensions and the ambiguities that were as existent at that time.
Right. So yeah, Shah Muhammad Ismail Rahmatullah is a very key figure of the book, and the first half really is in some way centered on him, and then his debate with Maulana Fazl Haq Khairabadi. He's the grandson of Shah Waliullah. That is oftentimes sort of the first detail that is mentioned in his biographies and so on. He's from the Waliullah tradition, but he's an interesting and curious figure because he in some ways is very much an intellectual heir to his grandfather, but also quite different in his intellectual temperament. Primarily in that he is much more of a public reformer. You know, Shah Waliullah Rahmatullah also had a notion of moral reform. He was also very uncomfortable with the conduct of the masses. He was also very uncomfortable, for example, in terms of the intimacy between Muslims and non-Muslims. And he was very critical, for example, about imitating the customs and habits of non-Muslims, especially Hindus and so on. So it's not that, you know, Shah Waliullah Rahmatullah did not have a conception of reform. He certainly did. But his conception of reform was part of a larger, what I call a moral cosmology, or this idea that, you know, this kind of the cosmological ideal template is being tarnished in terms of how Indian Muslims are leading their daily lives. So it was a very sort of philosophical, cosmologically oriented notion of moral reform. With Shah Muhammad Ismail, his grandson, what we see is that cosmology is still there in some ways. So that's what we see, that there's a very interesting, and I draw these very interesting contrasts and comparisons between the grandfather and the grandson, as I call in one section of the book. But in Shah Muhammad Ismail, the difference is that his is a much more public notion of reform. So he actually goes to the public in order to sort of evangelize the public, so to say. And interestingly, this is the same time period, the early 19th century, when we had sort of evangelicals in, for example, Northeast America and so on. So it's an interesting comparison between the Western context and the South Asian context to be made here also. So for example, he leads this very important and a massive widow remarriage campaign, where, you know, him and a number of his associates go door to door trying to get people remarried, widows remarried, and trying to stave off or trying to counter this taboo that they say has been associated with widow remarriage that comes from quote-unquote Hinduism. And I tell a very interesting story in the book in that he himself mentions that he himself had internalized this taboo. And his own sister was a widow who had not been remarried. And one day he's giving this sermon in a mosque, you know, someone raises his hand and he gets really embarrassed that this guy will now ask me about my own sister as I'm expounding on the virtues of widow remarriage. So he rushes back to his house and tells his sister, "Oh sister, you must get remarried." And she replies that, "Oh brother, I'm so old now. What will you get from my remarriage at this stage?" And he says that in order for my sermons to have any effectiveness, you have to get remarried. And she got remarried to an associate of his. And then this massive widow remarriage campaign was launched. So that's just one example of many such examples where he would, for example, go to, you know, famous brothels in Delhi and, you know, recite the Quran to them and make them weep in remorse and so on. So that's one key difference. And as part of this, his main, one of his, not main text, rather his most popular text that he wrote, called Energizing Faith or Fortifying Faith or Taqwiyatul Iman, in which he really presented this reform project in its most detailed fashion. And the reform project again had to do with the idea that in his imagination, the way in which the masses, the Indian Muslim masses, were conducting their daily lives, it compromised the absoluteness of divine sovereignty. So in his view, in terms of devotional practices and in terms of more customary practices, non-devotional practices. So in terms of, you know, how they boasted their lineage, or how they had these very sort of royal honorifics when they greeted each other, or the way in which people were really into these everyday practices like kite flying or chess and so on, or when it came to devotional practices like celebration of the Prophet's birthday and otherwise and so on. His view was that people have become so habituated to these practices that they are turning these practices into obligations, as if it's obligatory on them to take part in these practices and so on. So he saw these practices and the conduct of the masses to be undermining divine sovereignty. So that he wrote this text, Taqwiyatul Iman, this Urdu primer, one of the first Urdu primers that he wrote, and that created a major controversy in South Asia, in Delhi especially. Families get divided. Some see Shah Ismail as this great champion awakener, as this great reformer who's interrupting these practices that are causing this moral miasma. And other people look at him as this provocateur, as a sort of person with inferior intellectual capacities, who's just provoking the masses and making them think about these questions like, can God produce a second Muhammad or not? Or can God renege on his own promises or not, and so on. And there is this major debate around these two issues also. So there is that Shah Muhammad Ismail, this kind of a public reformer, who writes this Urdu primer and so on. But then there is this another Shah Muhammad Ismail who's deeply philosophical, who writes for a very specialized audience, who writes not in Urdu, but in very specialized Persian. And that's what I also try to capture in this very interesting text of his called Mansab-e-Imamat, or the Station of Leadership, in really sophisticated Persian. In chapter 4 of my book, I look at that chapter, and there a very different Shah Muhammad Ismail comes about. And that that book basically is about the question of what are the ideal qualities that a Muslim leader ought to have. And there we see a very minimalist Shah Muhammad Ismail. He takes the sort of normative Sunni position that, as long as a ruler is not completely morally corrupt and not completely on the precipice of unbelief, then you have to tolerate that kind of a moral leader and so on. He's very critical of different kinds of political leaders. I mean, the whole point of his reform project is a critique, a rebuke of Mughal aristocracy. But there we see a very minimalist Shah Muhammad Ismail. And what I tried to show was that actually the maximalist of Taqwiyatul Iman and the minimalist of Mansab-e-Imamat, they actually cohere and come together in rather interesting ways. That this is not actually a contradiction, but a sort of a larger way in which this coheres into a coherent reform project. So what I try to do in a nutshell is to bring these multiple sides of Shah Muhammad Ismail. I also look at this very interesting epistle of his called Yak Roza, or One Day, in which it's a deeply philosophical reflection again on the question of can God renege on his own promise or not, and can God create a second prophet or not. And there is a whole discussion of that epistle also. So what I try to do is present this figure in his complexity, that he's not some kind of a Puritan only who launched this very interesting jihad movement against the Sikhs also, and I do a very detailed analysis of that episode also. But to look at Shah Muhammad Ismail in all his complexities, there is a sort of a minimalist side to him, a maximalist side to him, a side to him which is very much attuned to the Hanafi traditions of his own family, but he also can take certain measures and certain interpretations of certain issues that are a bit more Salafi or a bit more aligned to what eventually became Ahle Hadith school. So I look at him in all his different complexities, is what I try to do by looking at his texts in these different languages and so on.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So yeah, I mean, what's clear is that ulama, for example, as actors, they are intensely complex and complicated human beings which evade sort of neat categorizations, if you like. And one of the things I found really interesting in the book was in his text when you were analyzing them was that the public order, i.e. moral reform, took priority over the religious scrupulousness of otherwise of the ruler. So, your minimalist approach as opposed to your sort of maximalist approach in public order as well. I guess I want to move on to something that you touched upon, which is this idea of the maslak, this normative orientation, which is something that's very much contested even here in the West as well. So if you can sort of maybe talk about that a little bit, and maybe even expand to talk about how it's different from a sect, maybe. And I mean, I noticed that you didn't use the word sect. I mean, a lot of people use this word to define it, but why you kind of framed it differently?
Right. A great question, and I'll try to be a bit more mindful of time here and give a shorter answer here. So let me answer your second question first, and then explain the idea of maslak a bit more. One of the key problems that we find in terms of Western academic scholarship on Islam, whether that is from a traditional standpoint or from a more quote-unquote academic standpoint, although these divisions can be quite blurry, is how to not replicate the categories and the vocabularies of a modern Christian political theology when writing about Islam. So hence, I'm also quite critical about using the category of orthodoxy, for example, in that replicates a certain kind of a Christian political theology. And I offer, my position in terms of why that category is problematic, in that it assumes that there is some kind of a distinct or a homogeneous or a certain identifiable orthodoxy with a certain address and names and places that can be identified and located as orthodoxy as such. Even if that is associated with contestation, that is a problematic category. And from that is the problem of the word sect. When you use the word sect, that sect has to be something that has deviated from something called orthodox. So that is a very sort of a Christian political theology that is at work here in terms of thinking about religious movements in terms of orthodoxies and sects. Whereas things are much more nuanced and flexible when it comes to multiple contexts of ulama traditions and contestations, including in modern South Asia. So all of these groups of scholars are from the same so-called orthodoxy of Muslim scholarly elite, the orthodoxy of what we might call Hanafi law and a certain association or attachment to Sufi traditions, for the Durban School from the Chishti Sabiri order, for the Barelvī School from the Qadiri order, and so on. So here comes the idea of maslak, which I translate as a normative orientation. And throughout the book, I use the term normativity, which I think provides a certain degree of elasticity, a certain degree of flexibility when talking about these internal or intra-Muslim contestations around what the normative should be and how do you distinguish the normative from the heretical, or the normative and the non-normative. So the way I talk about the idea of maslak is to try to make this concept as clear as possible, is that there are three major elements at work in terms of this idea of maslak. We can think of it as a conglomeration or a bringing together of three elements. One being knowledge, the second being interpretation, and the third being practice. So knowledge, the question is, what are the canonical sources of our authority? What sources do we go to when we decide on ethical questions, on legal questions, on normative questions? What are the sources of knowledge that are considered to be authoritative in our tradition? That's knowledge. Secondly, how do you interpret those sources? What is the interpretive mechanism that you employ in order to get to those sources? And third, what kinds of practices then come about in terms of how you think about one and two, knowledge and interpretation? So the three major masalik, the three major normative orientations in modern South Asian Islam, the Deobandis, Barelvis, and the Ahle Hadith, their main contestation is on these three questions of knowledge, hermeneutics, and practice. For the Barelvis and the Deobandis, the sources of knowledge are the same, which is the canon of the Hanafi legal school. Give or take, there is a certain kind of a agreement on the canonicity of that legal canon, right? So the knowledge tradition is quite similar. But the way in which it is interpreted and the kinds of practices that you derive from them, or your view on particular practices like celebration of the Prophet's birthday or other practices and so on, can be different. But when it comes to the whole debate between the Hanafi scholars, the Deobandis and the Barelvis, and the Ahle Hadith, the very sources of knowledge then are different. For the Ahle Hadith, you go straight to the Quran and the Sunnah, and the canonicity of the legal schools does not have the same weight as it does for the Hanafi traditionalists, the Barelvis and the Deobandis. And then you get competing notions of practices that have to do with certain practices like saying the Ameen out loud, Ameen bil Jahar, and Fatiha khalf al-Imam, and so on and so forth. So that's a compact way of thinking about the idea of maslak. Now, the key thing to remember here in terms of the context is that, and that's one of the key themes of the book also, which is that as British colonial power gets more and more consolidated in South Asia, how that leads to, especially in the post-1857, where Indian Muslims are brutally defeated by the British, and it's a massive catastrophe and a moral, political catastrophe, how does that time period then and the consolidation of British colonial power lead to the emergence of these competing Muslim groups? Or how do these earlier contestations take on a much more group-centered orientation? So to constantly think about the relationship between shifting colonial conditions and emerging modes of intra-Muslim discourse and contestation. That's one of the key themes of this book, to connect these conditions to the discourse. And that's basically the idea of masalik.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to go into an interesting topic which you talked about in the book, which is bid'ah, heretical innovation. And as I understood it, the Deobandis were, as a group, were more interested in protecting this idea of divine sovereignty, which was, and emphasizing the humanness of the Prophet, peace be upon him, whereas the Barelvis sort of had a different conceptualization. So I wondered if you could elaborate in terms of how, I think in one place you say they pushed the normativity or the imagination of how they understood this. So I'd be interested to look at, understand how you how you can talk about bid'ah for us there.
Sure. Yeah. So, as Dr. Haroon, this is a very incendiary topic, a very sensitive topic for many Muslims in South Asia, all over the world, really, even today. There are a few things I wanted to do with this idea in terms of its conceptualization. First of all, as many other scholars have also made the argument that translating this term, again, the politics of translation, as just innovation is problematic. It's not any innovation, this idea that somehow Islam is opposed to innovation, but it's the kind of innovation that opposes the normative model of the Prophet. which opposes the tradition, which opposes the weight of the tradition. So, but then of course, the key question that emerges is, when does an innovation become heretical? Or what kinds of innovations are permissible and what kinds are not? What kinds of innovations are innovations for religion, and what kinds of innovations are innovations in religion? So lid deen and fit deen. How do you distinguish the two? So in terms of, that's one thing I wanted to do. The second thing I really wanted to show was, and I actually spent quite a bit of time before I get to South Asia to look at the thought of this famous Andalusian 14th century Muslim jurist of the Maliki school, Maulana Ibrahim Ash-Shatibi. And his famous book on Bid'ah, this really, I think perhaps the most comprehensive and interesting book on Bid'ah in the pre-modern period, Al-I'tisam, the Adhering, in which he spends his whole introduction on this whole idea of estrangement. And he really thinks about this hadith of the Prophet that Islam began as a stranger and will return as a stranger like it began. So blessed are the estranged. And he uses that hadith to think about the idea of estrangement. That when you are steadfast, when you adhere, that's where the title of the book comes, to normativity, you become estranged in your own community. So he looks at bid'ah, the interplay between sunnah and bid'ah as this interplay between estrangement and acceptability. So the second point I wanted to make through a very close reading of this text of Ibrahim Ash-Shatibi, is to make the case that bid'ah is also a narrative concept. It's a narrative category. There's a certain kind of a narrativity associated with the idea of heretical innovation. Coming to the Deoband school now. This is a vast topic, and of course, the book will do more justice to it. But to be very brief, one thing I try to show is that for the Deoband school, as you very correctly mentioned, law and theology were always intimately interconnected. So the legal prohibition against heretical innovations was animated by the theological idea or the theological concern that many of the ritual practices current among the Indian Muslim masses are opposing the absolute sovereignty of the divine. Now, how is that the case? How is that possible? Their argument was, and this is a very key point I've made multiple times now, but I think it's an important point to repeat, that in their view, the practices that they contested, the practices that they called heretical innovation, such as, for example, the celebration of the Prophet's birthday, they only called it such in the specific conditions and in the specific context of North India, the world around them at that time. Their argument was that in and of themselves, these practices are not heretical innovations at all. In fact, they are really commendable practices that exalt the Prophet and so on and so forth. But their argument was that this practice or this other practice, which is the practice of giving food on the 3rd day or 40th day of someone's death to the destitute, and the idea is that the blessings that you get or the rewards that you get from this act of charity are then transmitted to the soul of the deceased, or what is known as Isal-e-Sawab, or the Fatiha, as it is often called in South Asia, because people recite the Fatiha above the food, and then you get the blessings transmitted to the deceased. So his main argument was Maulana SherAli Tareen, for example, of the Deoband School, who wrote most extensively on this topic, that although in and of themselves these practices are completely salutary, the attitude with which the masses are engaging in them is what is making them heretical innovations. And his main litmus test was that, then people asked him, how do you know that people are understanding these practices to be obligatory? That was his main argument. Sorry, I missed a step. So his main argument was that the regularity and the passion and the frequency, the steadfastness and the commitment with which the masses were engaging in these practices was such that they had turned these practices, as if they had turned these practices into obligations. When, according to the Sharia, according to the normative values of the Sharia, these practices were in fact simply permissible, or at best commendable. They were not obligatory. So his main idea was that the values of the Sharia, the obligations and the commendables and the permissibles, those values are being confused in the way in which the masses are engaging in these practices. And his main argument, which is an argument that many other Muslim scholars also make, is that these practices, what makes them particularly dangerous is that the masses engage in them thinking that they are really good devotional practices, that they're very salutary practices. Maulana SherAli Tareen likens them to tempting sweets or mithai, which makes young kids salivate. It's very pleasurable on the moment of intake, but it can only harm the health of the young and earnest in the long run, is the analogy that he makes. There are many, many culinary analogies throughout the book. And that's also a flavor of South Asia that I tried to capture here of our discourses of our ulama. So that was his main argument, that the way in which the masses are engaging in these practices is undermining the boundaries of law, which in turn is undermining the absolute sovereignty of the divine. So that is what I call the relationship between theology, law, and everyday practice. That's how this law theology practice, what I call a political theology, that's a distinct example of that. So that was his main position. His second main position was that over time, the masses have engaged in these practices in a way that have made them much more corrupted than what they were when they originally became a part of Muslim history or South Asian history. So to give a very quick and brief example, for example, his argument in terms of this ritual of distributing food on the third day of someone's death was that, in the beginning stages of this ritual, it was a good ritual that you give food to the destitute, and it's an act of charity. So it does some good social good and also some good for the soul of the deceased. But his argument was that, in his present in North India, the reason why the masses are engaging in these practices is to show off wealth, that how much wealth they have in terms of the food that they distribute, and affectation, a riya, etc. And he proposes an experiment, and he says that, rather than publicly giving this food and inviting everyone from the community and publicly giving this food, if you tell someone that, why don't you privately just give some charity or privately give some donations to a madrasa or a mosque, people will react and say, Subhanallah, how can we give money and people not even take note of it? So that for Maulana Thanvi really confirmed the affectation that has entered into this otherwise salutary ritual. So the conceptual point that I make, and here I will close this discussion. The conceptual point that I make here is that there is a certain notion of moral decay, a certain notion of how history, the way in which these rituals have traveled in history, how history has over time made these rituals morally corrupted and made the masses, how they're engaging in these practices, morally corrupted. And they saw their own imagination, their own role as the ulama, as the reformers, to intervene in this corrupt history and to change its course, to intervene in this history and to undermine these practices, to get rid of these practices in order to cleanse and purify the corruptions that have become accumulated over time. So this was a very sort of notion of looking at time as having been corrupted. And that's conceptually a very important point for me, of how in their imaginary, Indian Islam at this stage had reached an emergency point, which required an emergency intervention on the part of scholars. And that's how they imagined their own role as Muslim reformers. The reason why this point is so important is that their opposing school then picks on precisely this point to the Barelvī school or Ahmad Raza Khan to critique the Deoband position. That's why these are the two major aspects of their position: the interpretive position of how theology, law, and practice come together, and then the philosophical position of the decay of practices over time in history, and the role of the ulama to then purify by making an emergency intervention into the disciplined life of the community or the ritual life of the community.
Thank you. I really want to explore some of the key contentious points, but we don't really have time. And I think hopefully the people, when they ask questions, they can really dive into them, in terms of Inkani Kiz, whether God can lie, whether God can create another prophet like Muhammad, whether the prophet has knowledge of the unseen. But one of the things I want to just quickly touch upon as well is you try, once you've sort of unpacked these differences, you try and look at key areas of convergences, which is really interesting. And you try and frame it in such a way to show, for example, that Ahmad Raza Khan, for him, rather than condemning practices, what was required was reforming them and trying to bring them back in line. Whereas for the Deobandis, because divine sovereignty took precedence, right? There was this idea that we're not even going to consider that as an option, and we should, anything that's a mustahab act, as soon as it becomes corrupted, rather than reforming them, we sort of have to remove those acts as well. Now, and then you give examples of how those convergences might have come together. So, for example, weddings, and you give the examples of how they were quite gendered. So I wondered if you could talk about points of convergence for all of us.
Absolutely. Haroon, as you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, one of the key goals of this book is to add complexity to stereotypical ways of looking at the ulama. in this case, South Asian ulama, but in general, all ulama for that matter, or Muslim scholars more generally speaking. So one of the stereotypes that we often see in terms of the relationship between the Deoband school and the Barelvī school, or how we look at, for example, someone like SherAli Tareen from the Deoband school and Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan, the founder of the Barelvī school, is that the Deoband pioneer was, very strict and this kind of a Puritan and restricted everything. And the pioneer of the Barelvī school was inclusive and was quite, his attitude was much more elastic and was much more permissive when it came to these practices. As I mentioned in the answer to your last question, that for Maulana SherAli Tareen also, these practices that he critiqued were completely commendable in and of themselves. It's a very different kind of logic. It's not a logic of I'm for it or against it. It's not either or. It's not permissive or strict, but rather it's a very specific logic having to do with law, theology, and ritual practice, and the notion of history. Similarly with Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan, it's not that he was okay with all practices, the way in which the masses conducted them. He, in fact, as I show, was deeply critical of the masses in terms of how they engaged in the very practices that he eagerly defended, like the celebration of the Prophet's birthday. His argument was that there is tremendous room of improvement or moral pedagogy in terms of the conduct of the masses. So he was not this kind of a lax libertine by any means. In fact, in some measure, he perhaps was even more strict than the Deoband pioneers. So that's one key convergence between these two schools. Second key convergence is, and that's a very sort of the most striking convergence, is that both of their reform projects had a certain notion of social order and a certain kind of a social reorganization of society. So for example, I talk about how both of these schools and their pioneers were extremely critical of how weddings and engagement ceremonies or rituals of death were conducted in South Asia. They are very sort of sarcastic texts of both of these scholars. I show both Maulana SherAli Tareen and Ahmad Raza Khan of how, for example, Maulana SherAli Tareen calls it the wedding and engagement ceremonies, the greater doomsday and the lesser doomsday. And then Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan also really is deeply critical of the conduct, especially of women. Of course, these are very gender discourses. That's another commonality, but also of men in these rituals and so on. And the point that I try to make through that discussion is an important point, by the way, which is that for these scholars, reforming the social order through these ritual practices that are not only devotional practices, but these sort of societal practices, weddings, engagements, kite flying, and so on, is so important precisely because they're trying to reimagine the social order. And the reason why that's an important point is that an argument which has been made about especially the Deoband school is that the Deoband school was marked by what one scholar who wrote a pioneering book on Deoband, and on whose shoulders all of us sort of scholars who have now done work on this rest, Professor Barbara Metcalf, a phenomenal book that she wrote in 1982, I believe. But one of the main arguments of that book on Deoband was that the Deoband school is marked by what she called an inward turn, a move away from matters of politics. And the argument that I try to make is that thinking about the conduct of the body, the individual body, in terms of how individuals have to conduct themselves in the public sphere, and these matters of societal reorganization in terms of these devotional and non-devotional practices, this is deeply political. The politics should not be restricted to the modern state or to electoral democracy, but rather the disciplining of the body, and through that, the disciplining of the public sphere, the curation of what they called moral publics, is a deeply political enterprise. We just have to think about politics not in this kind of a liberal secular notion of politics as restricted to the modern state or electoral democracy, but have a more capacious notion of politics that includes these kinds of practices of disciplining, which is a point, of course, that the famous anthropologist, Allah yarhamuha, Professor Sabah Mahmood made in a pioneering book, The Politics of Piety. That's where, of course, that's my inspiration, of course, for this. But coming back to your point, and I'll very briefly address what was then Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan's position. The key difference then, but all these convergences, and I also make the argument, these convergences should not have us undermine the seriousness of the disagreement also. On the legal side of things, the main disagreement was for Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan, the default value of all practices is that of permissibility. Al-ibaha, that's the asl, that's basically the default value. And unless there was a conclusive proof text showing a practice to not be permissible, the default value is that of permissibility. So if the masses are understanding the Mawlid, for example, or the celebration of the Prophet's birthday as obligatory, what the scholar should do then is to morally educate the masses, to engage in their moral purification and to counsel them and so on, not completely eradicate the practice altogether. So for him, the situation had not reached this kind of an emergency point that you completely eradicate practices that are a means and an avenue to exalt the Prophet. So in his political theology, in the Barelvī political theology, which is quite close to the Khairabadian political theology of the early 19th century, the Prophet is at the apogee of Muslim cosmology. And you cannot eradicate practices that are a means to access the Prophet. And there is no tension between divine sovereignty and its absoluteness and prophetic authority. Rather, the divine sovereign and the Prophet, in fact, they are intimately intertwined. Prophetic authority and divine sovereignty are intimately intertwined in the relationship of the lover and the beloved. So, so that was their political theology of how we should think about the relationship between God and the Prophet, and through that, then how we should think about the practices of everyday life among the community. So his main argument was, and this was a major disagreement here, for example, that these practices which have become regularized in the community, a community should use its own temperament, or rather a community should privilege its own, what you call a temperament, mizaj, or what you call its own welfare or maslaha, in terms of how it choreographs or how it engages in its everyday moral conduct. If some corruptions come, then yes, scholars should intervene and correct them. But there should be a harmony between the welfare, the temperament of a community and its practices. So a great example of that, and on this I will end because it really will capture the point, is a disagreement between these two schools on the whole question of, can you specify a date for these practices, like the Mawlid or the third day of someone's death to give food, and so on and so forth, many other practices. So for the Durban School, specifying a date is problematic. Why? Because specifying a date means that you are simulating the obligations of the religion, praying, which has specific times, fasting, Hajj, and so on and so forth. So you can't specify a date. You keep on mixing and changing things. They said, Maulana Thanvi said that, some year you do it on this date, some day you do it on other date. You keep on changing the form of the practice also. Some year you distribute sweets, some year you distribute wheat or something else. Keep changing the form and keep changing the time and date, so that these permissible practices don't mirror or simulate obligations. For Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan, on the other hand, there is nothing wrong with specifying a date. In his perspective, the continuity of these practices would only be ensured if you have a date. You would only go somewhere if you knew when something is to happen. So the continuity of a practice is only established through these kinds of specifications. The larger argument being that a community should organize its ritual life according to its needs, according to its welfare, according to its temperament. So here we see two very competing perspectives on the relationship between the individual and the society. And this is the larger point of this part of the book, on which I will really end this answer. And it's an important conceptual point that will really bring things together. The relationship between the individual and the society. For the Deoband School, the society that they lived in was in a state of moral decay and corruption. It was in a state of moral miasma. And the job of the individual was to stay separated from this corrupted society and to guard himself or herself from this corrupted society. And the scholar had to intervene in this corrupt society to transform it. And the situation had reached an emergency point. For Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan, there was more of a relationship of harmony between the individual and society. That things had not reached this kind of a corrupt emergency point that required this kind of drastic measures that you completely outlaw the celebration of the Prophet's birthday, for example. And in his view, you cannot think of history as morally decaying across time all the time. And you cannot say that only what happened in the Prophet's time, on the time of his companions, was salutary, and from then on, it's a story of progressive moral decay. And to make this point, he would often quote this evocative hadith of the Prophet that my community is like rain shower. One cannot tell whether the beginning of rain shower is better or its end. مثل أمتي مثل المطر لا يدرى أوله خير أم آخره. So his point in quoting this hadith was that, for the Deoband school, his point was that the Deoband school has made Muslim masses so anxious about this whole business of not confusing the obligations with the permissible, then you think of the world as in a state of moral decay, whereas one should have much more confidence in terms of how one thinks about the evolution of history over time. But for him also, the masses were in a state of major moral decay. But the solution was not to eradicate these practices, but rather to morally reform the masses. So sorry, quite a bit has been covered here, and there is many more details which are of course in the book, but I just wanted to cover the major aspects. And this is only the legal aspects. We haven't even got into the theology and the whole question of ilm al-ghaib and all of that. But yeah,
I mean, those are really interesting talking points, but no interview would be complete of your book without talking about Haji Imdadullah, who's really central in your book. But I mean, you talk earlier in the book about epistemic neighborlessness, which is this idea of the Hanafi madhab. But I mean, talking about Haji Imdadullah, but also talking about how many of these especially both these schools, they shared a generation of scholars. There was much overlap in terms of their learning, the intellectual genealogy. I wonder if you could talk about this, because this is often missed in the conversation, and I think it's a really important part to talk about.
Absolutely, absolutely. Two things I will say very briefly in response to that. So in the final chapter of the book, chapter 12, I look at Haji Imdadullah Mahajir Makki Rahmatullah Alayh, and his really interesting, brief but very interesting text, Faisla Haft Masala, which essentially I have translated also in the book, or large parts of it, where he tries to bring these two groups of scholars not together, but create some kind of a harmony between them, or some kind of an agreement, or some kind of a rapprochement in terms of their attitudes towards each other. So his main argument was that that look, these kinds of intra-ulama feuds and these kinds of intra-ulama contestations, what they do is that they oftentimes undermine the stature of the ulama among the masses. So his was also a very hierarchical viewpoint. This was not some kind of, and this is a point that I stress in that chapter, this was not some kind of a liberal, secular move towards moderating religion, that, you should all get moderate and you should not fight too much and so on. This was not some kind of a liberal, secular notion of moderation that we today see, for example, in many Muslim and non-Muslim states, this idea of moderating Islam, which essentially means separating it from itself, which comes from, the word moderare, to tame, to control, to restrain life. This is not a liberal secular moderation, but rather a deeply traditional, a deeply hierarchical notion of ulama coming, mending their fences, mending their differences, so that their stature in the eyes of the masses remains elevated. And he, of course, uses these arguments in which he actually uses, although he's a Sufi master, but he uses legal arguments in terms of talking about these contested issues like the Mawlid and these other sort of issues and so on. 7 problems, he's mentioned 7 problems that were most contentious in his view. Of course, he's in Mecca this time. He he had to flee India after the repercussions of the War of 1857. But he had disciples from both the Barelvī school and, of course, the pioneers of Durban School are his major disciples. And he uses arguments that in some ways are very nuanced, that use sources from Sufi thought also, and also from the legal vocabulary. And he really takes positions which are quite nuanced and complex. And I can't go into the details of those positions. You'll have to read the chapter for the details. But to put it very briefly, what he tries to do is he tries to open up possibilities that would look at both of the positions as normatively possible. And he does that quite masterfully, in fact. What he does is what I call, he celebrates ambiguity, that you have to celebrate ambiguity when it comes to these positions and these contestations. So that's what I show in terms of a close reading of this very interesting text, Fast Life Masla. The second part of the chapter looks at this very interesting debate that emerges then about the authenticity of a master-disciple relationship. So people started raising objections that, if he is nuancing these positions of the Deoband pioneers, what is the status of the relationship between Haji Imdadullah Mahajir Makki and his Deoband pioneers? And it's a very fascinating exchange of letters that takes place between an anonymous disciple of Maulana SherAli Tareen, in which he addresses this anonymous disciple's doubts about the authenticity of this relationship. And the last part of the chapter looks at this very interesting dream that is narrated, in which the Prophet himself appears and actually decides in favor of the Deoband ulama. The point that I tried to make was in that chapter that, despite their disagreements of sorts, which are very nuanced, their relationship remained always intact. That both the disciples and the Sufi master were okay with there not being 100% compatibility or agreement on these contentious questions. So this gives us a very good example, and this connects to the point that you were raising. That even if we look at these intra-Deobandi tensions, or if we look at the Deobandi-Barelvi sort of disagreement in its 19th century context, there is a certain etiquette of disagreement. These disagreements were contentious. They were around very sensitive issues. Many of these issues would not even be possible to be discussed, for example, in contemporary South Asia, especially, of course, in contemporary Pakistan and so on. But there was an etiquette of disagreement. They were very sarcastic towards each other. And it was spirited, but it had intellectual depth. It had intellectual nuance. It showcased the breadth and the galaxy of the Muslim canon in Arabic and Persian and Urdu. And for that matter, and for that reason, I think it provides us with an excellent example, an excellent model of a spirited but yet bound by etiquette intra-Muslim disagreement. And the point that I try to make is that if you look at the internal logics of this disagreement, it undermines the liberal secular as well as the contemporary neo-imperial attempts to look at intra-Muslim debates through these modern Western binaries like mystical, legal, good Muslim, bad Muslim. And the final point that I want to make, and then regarding this larger point, is that, one of the key attitudes that we see, not key, major or prominent attitudes, widespread attitudes that we see among non-Muslims and even among many Muslims in South Asia today, for example, is that, this debate, and perhaps even among many traditionalist circles in some measure, whereas the idea is that, let's leave it aside, that this is a contentious debate. It's too contentious and sensitive. Let's leave it aside. It's been too long now. Let's move on and so on. That is one attitude. The other attitude is that, this debate had to do with issues that have nothing to do with our contemporary world, that have nothing to do with philosophically nuanced points. Can one celebrate the Prophet's birthday or not? Can one stand up in terms of receiving his blessings or not? Can you raise both of your hands over food while saying the Fatiha or not? What relevance does this have to the modern world? And these are some arcane squabbles of an intellectual elite that had something to do with the 19th century, but nothing to do with today. The whole book really is a critique of this kind of a dismissive attitude. And what I try to show is that what may seem to us as these kind of arcane squabbles or, that have nothing to do with the present world are in fact deeply philosophically engaging, enriching, nuanced, that have to do with this larger idea of political theology of how we ought to think about sovereignty in a world in which political sovereignty is rapidly disintegrating. It has to do with these very nuanced points about how we think about history and its relationship to the present, how we think about the relationship between the individual and the society, how do we think about the relationship between time and tradition? So these are some very important philosophical, conceptual problems at stake and at work in this intra-Muslim polemic. But we will only be able to get to that if we do a close reading of the internal logics, and to combine a close reading of these internal logics by reading their texts in Arabic, Persian, Urdu, but then by connecting them to these larger philosophical, theoretical questions that are coming from the Western humanities. So in a nutshell, really, this book is a conversation between the Muslim humanities and the Western humanities to enrich and to add further nuance to this very important, critical, and dynamic heritage of South Asian Islam specifically, and modern Islam more broadly.
Thank you very much. I've got one question. Any discussion, debate when it comes to ulama is never divorced from food, as you know, and in your book, you fill it with food, if you like. There's a filling of food. And so I want to ask you the question, and then I'm going to open up the floor to questions.
We've got lots of questions on the hands up Zoom, so please.
Okay, we'll take that on. What's with the gastronomic imagination of the ulama? If you can quickly answer that question, I think that would be a really...
Yeah, you know, two things. One is that, references to food is a very important part of the ulama discursive imaginary. References to food and also narratives and storytelling. So, you know, I use quite plentifully these kinds of biographies and narrative collections of narratives and so on, because this is a very important register of how the ulama engage in discourses. And, you know, did this actually happen or not is really secondary. It is a very important part of the ulama normative imaginary. So what I noticed in terms of especially this one text, which I think is one of the most dense texts, but one of the most enjoyable. Well, it's a very contentious text, but also very enjoyable intellectually. Let's say this text, Al-Barahin Al-Qati'a, by Maulana Khalil Ahmad Saharanpuri, in which he is, this is kind of a line-by-line refutation of Maulana Abdul Sami Rampuri, who had written this text called Anwar Sati'a, which was a refutation of the Deobandī views on these issues and so on. And what I saw in this text was is kind of a line by line. So it's on the top part of the text is Maulana Rampuri's text, and then Khalil Ahmad Saharanpuri's text was on the bottom. That there's a lot of food analogies here, culinary analogies here. A lot of analogies that have to do with. I'll give you just one example. So this whole question of praying over food, is that permissible or not? So Maulana Rampuri makes the argument, and I might have to paraphrase from my book. This is, I think, in chapter 9 or 8, 9 perhaps. Yes, I think it's 9, chapter 9. This is in chapter 9. So listeners can look at it more carefully there. But he makes the argument that, look, when you bring different ingredients together in a dish, he uses the example of biryani. If all the ingredients are salutary and they're okay, from the combination that the dish that you get is also okay. So he makes the argument that, you know, the Durban schools are really, the pioneers are unnecessarily objecting to this ritual, in that, you know, the different components of it, distributing food, praying over food and so on, it's completely fine, because the individual ingredients, the saffron and the meat and the rice and so on, the murakkab, the bringing together of this is also okay, and it's salutary. So in response to that, Maulana Khalil Ahmad Saharanpuri's main argument, of course, here is that, we are not objecting to this distribution of food. What we're objecting is to the specific form, the hayyat qada'iyya, the specific form that this ritual has taken on in South Asia. And his other argument is that the raising of two hands over food is doing tashabbuh of the Hindus, so the reprehensible imitation of the Hindus. So he counter argues and say, yeah, all the ingredients are great, and we also make great biryani. But if some kind of a poisonous ingredient has entered into the biryani, the whole dish gets vitiated. So he also comes back, and then at another point he makes the argument that we do consider the time of the Prophet to be the ideal time, but the later temporalities, later time, does not have the same kind of sacrosanct value as the prophetic time. And to use that, to make that point, Maulana Khalil Ahmad Saharanpuri, I think, makes the analogy between korma and sort of animal manure. And he makes the argument that, Maulana Rampuri is confusing the delicacy of a palau, of a korma with that of animal manure and so on. So anyways, so there's two examples, many other examples, the mithai example of Maulana Thanvi. Yeah. So it's very interesting. And the point that I try to make is that it's very interesting how the materiality of food is so central to their arguments. So, for example, for Maulana Khalil Ahmad Saharanpuri, the main argument that he uses, so Maulana Rampuri makes gives the evidence that, at the Battle of Tabuk, the Prophet had prayed over food, and that food then multiplied, and then everyone was able to get nourished through that food. So Maulana Rampuri had argued that, the Prophet himself had prayed over food. Why are you objecting to it? So he makes the argument, Maulana Khalil Ahmad Saharanpuri makes the argument that the Prophet prayed over food, and that food then multiplied. So it had a salutary effect on food. Whereas in the Fatiha in South Asia, people are so obsessed with the food, and the food comes and they don't eat it for a long time, and they're just, praying over it and so on, that the food goes cold. So here what happens is that the food actually gets corrupted and polluted over time. So he makes the argument that you actually a false analogy, qiyas mal fariq, in that over there the food multiply, and over here actually there is an izalat at-ta'am, there the food actually gets disintegrated. So the point there is that how the materiality of food is so central to the normative arguments that they're making. So yes, food is very central. The materiality of food is quite central to these hermeneutical temperaments, and that's one of the major goals of this book, is to really bring the ulama with all their personality in terms of their narratives. And these were not some kind of scholastic, arcane scholars cloistered in their study rooms. They really had a great sense of humor, and there's tremendous sarcasm also. So I bring the very complex philosophical debates, but also this larger sort of personas and their personalities to bear, so that we can learn from them.
Yeah, thank you very much. Talking about sense of humor and talking about food, let's bring everybody else to our feast, and they can feast with us.
Okay, we're gonna have the first question from Maulana Sheikh Asim Yusuf. I'm gonna unmute him. Maulana Sahab.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Jazakallah for this for this talk and this discussion, and to Dr. Tareen. I think the book is fantastic. I've been waiting literally a quarter of a century for somebody to write. Just someone to put this in a bit of context. And I have tried desperately with my Barelvī and Deobandī friends and fellow scholars to get them to try to see the other side with no success whatsoever. So Jazakallah khair for that. I think the point that the points that you made, the question I had, you actually answered already. But I'll sort of try and rephrase it. So I'll just pick one of my questions. The main thing I think is that it appears to me, and I am, and please bear in mind, I'm not an Urdu speaker, so I don't have access to any of the primary texts at all. But it does appear to me in many different spheres of our Islamic religious debate and discussion that there are certain unspoken assumptions that we make. There are certain, well, I think they're called meta-theoretic presuppositions, but there are certain points that we assume. For example, the point about society is inevitably decaying. Yes, but there may still be some good in the end. But it is these ultimately that the ulama, any person who is doing any sort of thought, takes those as the boundaries or the boundaries of their thought, of their thinking, and then applies religion to them. So it goes to the scriptural resources, and they are inevitably looking at them in a particular way. They are looking at them from the perspective of, effectively, how does this support a subconscious belief that I already hold? So that I think is something, and that's why these two groups, who are so close to each other in many different ways, as you have said, can arrive at diametrically opposed conclusions about very specific topics. So you had mentioned the point, I think, about the idea of, you know, the Barelvī or the Allah Hazrat. We shouldn't really say Barelvī because it's really pretty much just Allah Hazrat, but Allah Hazrat's position that that there is still, you know, good in, you know, various, you know, religious activities such as Mawlid and so forth. Allah Hazrat, as you've quite rightly said, and I think a lot of people who don't read, you know, who are unaware of Allah Hazrat are quite unaware of this, is that he was extremely strict. He was an extremely strict faqih when it came to the mu'amalat. And it seems very much to me, and I want to take your take on this, but it seems to me that his if you like, the latitude that he gives is always in support of a notion of the if you like, the importance of maintaining a connection to the spiritual hierarchy, first of which being the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but then also with things like urus and so forth with the awliya Allah, which is why no matter how bad things were at those gatherings, in actuality, they should not be left in their entirety. Every effort should be made to correct the problems, but maintain the gatherings. And this seemed very much to be related to his primary goal, which was to make what he felt was the most important thing of all, which is to maintain the connection to the Prophet ﷺ and the spiritual hierarchy, which also then explains his many of the theological positions that he took contra the Deobandis in relation to the way that the Prophet was referred to, spoken to, and so forth. So I just wanted to get your take on that. If you can, to use your food analogy, if you can take all those ingredients I've chucked at you and make a biryani out of it in the form of a question, please do provide an answer.
Thank you, Dr. Yusuf. I think you have really captured the essence of Ala Hazrat's position and also its contrast with the Deoband school. The key term that you used here is the term spiritual hierarchy. There is very much an investment in guarding and maintaining this hierarchy, according to which it's not the humanity of the Prophet, but rather the cosmic authority of the Prophet as the most beloved subject of God that has to be preserved. And that kind of a hierarchy, what I call a political theology, is what is at stake for him in this debate. Now, at the same time, it's not as if the Deoband school does not have a notion of prophetic love. They also have their own notion of prophetic love. But their notion of prophetic love, at least in the writings of Maulana SherAli Tareen, what we see is there is an emphasis on celebrating the humanity of the Prophet. So, there is at one point he says that it's not offensive speech if you call the Prophet your brother, in that, the perfection of the Prophet's prophethood is the perfection of his humanity. What Maulana SherAli Tareen says. So there are two competing notions of prophetic love. That then gets translated into two different notions of the relationship between God, the Prophet, and the community. One is a very hierarchical spiritual notion. The other has a more egalitarian emphasis to it. With the added caveat that the Deoband school is also very hierarchical, of course. It's not as if it's some kind of a liberal democratic, appropriation of how we think about hierarchies and so on. But nonetheless, there is a certain kind of an egalitarian to how they imagine the Prophet and his relationship to the community. There is one place where I quote Maulana Thanvi. I might have to paraphrase, but I think I might have it in mind here. Is that he says that you turn the Prophet into a god, but a defective one. We understand him to be human, but a perfect one. So, there are many of these kinds of phrases, and of course, there are counter phrases also. But you're absolutely correct in that when it comes to the mu'amalat, when it comes to these practices, he's deeply critical. When it comes to the relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims, that's my second book project that I'm working on right now, called Hindu-Muslim Encounters, that is really centered on Deoband actors, but also Ala Hazrat, especially in the context of the Khilafat movement and its debates with people like Abul Kalam Azad and Maulana Bari of the Farangi Mahal School on this whole question of allying with Gandhi or not in the context of the Khilafat movement. On this question of Muslim-non-Muslim relations also, he's perhaps even more strict than many Deoband scholars. But yes, there is a certain kind of a investment in the hierarchy and also an investment in the integrity of the text. And what I mean by that is this. One of the key arguments that Ala Hazrat uses throughout his throughout his different texts that are then captured in my book, in chapter 9, is that his argument is that, leading luminaries of the Muslim tradition in South Asia and elsewhere have been calling these practices completely legitimate. Maulana Suyuti and many, many others, the whole Waliullah family itself, for example. So why are these Deoband scholars now coming in the 19th century and saying that these practices, which had been okay for hundreds of years and people had no problem with, they're now coming and calling them heretical innovations? That's going against the whole weight of history. So to add to your point about preserving spiritual hierarchy, he's also into preserving the integrity of the text. You don't tamper with the tradition. That's his main charge against the Deoband school, that they're tampering with the tradition. They're tampering with an ongoing tradition. The Deoband pioneers would respond and say that, yeah, we also know about this whole tradition and we also are okay with these practices in and of themselves, but the conditions in which the masses are engaging in these practices in North India, even if Maulana Suyuti was in India right now, he would outlaw the Maulid. So that's their counter argument, that empirical conditions, that the empirical sort of data that we see around us is what makes these otherwise salutary practices problematic. So this is a very nuanced difference in terms of interpretive moves, in terms of their assessment of the conditions, that cannot be reduced to some kind of a debate between inclusivism and exclusivism, law and Sufism. They both subscribe to what you call the metaphysical boundaries and logics and rules of the tradition. Thank you.
We have a question from Yahya Bert. I'm just going to unmute him.
Salam,
Okay,
good to meet you in person, or not in person.
Assalamu alaikum. Really nice to meet you, Dr. Tareen. It's a fantastic book, and you know, I have nothing but praise for it. But let me push you on a couple of things that I felt weren't spelt out in the book, and just for my own like elucidation, how you would answer. I'm intrigued in your answer. So it's a kind of two-part question, really. The first part is the modernity that you don't really define in the book, is the modernity the sort of the conditions of coloniality, of colonial modernity, creating a public sphere, the shift to print, and the kind of changed structures of society, disruption of hierarchy, of the Mughal hierarchy, and of the sort of the patronage of the ulama, and the ulama turning to society, or is your emphasis on those structural changes, or is it on another idea of modernity, which is the contending, you know, Shmili Eisenstadt's idea of multiple modernities, or the contending modernities project of your supervisor, Ibrahim Musa? So the contending modernity, ulama themselves are contending with a different formulation of modernity, so centered around the sovereign subject. So if there's no sovereign ruler, and we're now under the control of colonial kufr, we are now in a position where we basically have a turn to the subject, the Muslim subject, and how is that Muslim subjectivity to be formulated? And that is why the person of the Prophet and the boundaries between Muslim and non-Muslim are placed, because it's about how if you can't reform from the top down, you reform from the bottom up, and your focus now is on Muslim society and keeping it strong, morally strong, through this period of trial. And the difference is basically between the two groups is how you go about doing that. That's essentially the only real difference. And so those are contending modernities about Muslim subjectivity and modernity, if you like. Is that the modernity you mean? So I think that's my first. I felt that could have been spelled out more. That's my first comment or question. And my second question is a kind of extension of the book, really, coming from my own background of being someone who's academically studied Islam in Britain for many decades now, and having been Muslim for over 30 years. You know, the biggest structural fault line or structural division within British Islam is the Deobandī Barelvī polemic still. Okay, despite all the huge changes that we've had in Britain over the last 30 years, huge changes. Okay, I won't go into those changes, but it's still the case that institutionally speaking, maybe less so the public sphere, but institutionally, it's the major distinction within British Islam. How do we account for the longevity of this division from 19th century India, not only in modern day India or South Asia, but also in the diaspora? How do we explain its persistent longevity and its ability to reproduce itself through time and through space? Because we in Britain, we've gone through an experience where second generation British Muslims went to the Arab world to discover other dimensions of traditional Islam. And what ended up happening was we had an element of recruitment, in some cases recruitment of Arab scholars, in drafting them into the Deobandī Barelvī polemic in the UK. So they were drafted, if you like, into one side or the other. Right. Look, we have the authority of Arab scholars for our argument. Right. See what I mean? So it was like a ratcheting up from the 90s onwards in the UK, a ratcheting up of the range of references and so on, once these scholars accessed Arabic scholarship. And similarly, had Arab scholars saying they were bemused by the intensity and longevity of this discussion about the nature, Prophet's nature and so on. They'd never really quite seen anything like it, this long debate on secondary characteristics that are not in the primary part of Aqidah. So the Arab scholars themselves being bemused and so on. But my main point is, how do we explain this longevity into beyond the colonial period, into post-colonial modernity, into diaspora and so on?
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Yahya, for those great questions. The first one I'll try to address. The second one I'll try to speculate. The first question about modernity, getting really to the heart of the point. One of the things which is oftentimes a conceptual challenge when you're studying about Muslim intellectual discourses or intra-Muslim debates in conditions of colonial modernity is that when you come across actors who seem to be making arguments that seem to be mirroring or that seem to be quite similar to modern, I know Protestant is a much more complex category, but for heuristic purposes, let's call it modern Protestant notions of religion, which is anti-hierarchical or emphasizing the humanity, for example, of the Prophet and so on. The challenge then tends to be, how does one think about the relationship between the modern colonial epistemic condition and these indigenous Muslim discourses and so on? I mean, is it just a relationship of influence? To put it much more bluntly, can we think of a scholar like Shah Muhammad Ismail, for example, as a Muslim Protestant who's making these kinds of arguments and so on? That becomes a conceptual challenge. The way I try to address and resolve that challenge, and that connects to your question, is by making a distinction between the technological conditions, the institutional conditions of colonial modernity with things like print, the emergence of the colonial state and so on, that evacuates the space of religion as in terms of its commitment to quote unquote liberal secularism, but that the space of religion that it evacuates paradoxically becomes much more contentious through these intra-Muslim and inter-religious debates and so on. So the context really is that Muslims have lost their political sovereignty, and in the 1857 world, they realize that political sovereignty is no longer a possibility. So the focus then shifts to these questions of ritual life. The argument that I make is that everyday life then becomes a synecdoche, sort of symbolizes power. So it's no longer the state that you have to acquire, but rather it is in the choreography of everyday life that power becomes enshrined. And that's where the Prophet becomes so contested, in that how will we imagine the Prophet now? As we've lost our political sovereignty, it's really the Prophet's body, how we remember it, and then how it will inform our daily life that becomes the fulcrum of power. So coming back to the point though, I make a distinction between the technological and institutional conditions of modernity and the epistemic assumptions of colonial modernity. And my argument is that these ulama, although they had to contend with these new conditions that were not of their making, when it came to the intellectual content of these debates, we cannot assimilate the intellectual content to the epistemology of colonial modernity. So when an actor like Shah Muhammad Ismail is engaging in a debate on Shafa'ah or these questions of can there be a second prophet or not, he is really engaging in his own indigenous intellectual tradition that he is then repackaging and contending with the conditions of colonial modernity. As I mentioned in the book, his sermons at the Jamia Mosque in Delhi get banned because according to the British resident officer, they were creating too much controversy and so on. And he only gets reinstated when he convinces them that he's really just talking about divine sovereignty, which they find to be quite palatable to their Protestant sensibilities. So clearly there is a new sheriff in town. There is no question that they have to contend with a new set of conditions. But the intellectual content, when it comes to the Barelvī-Deobandī debates, for example, on bid'ah and so on, has a much longer history, has its own logics that cannot be assimilated to the epistemic conditions of colonial modernity. So I come at it at a middle position, so to say. And this distinction between technological and institutional conditions and the epistemology of colonial modernity, I think this is a useful distinction to make to get at this whole problem of how we think about colonial modernity and its relationship to Muslim intellectual discourse. Your second point. Here I will speculate. I think a lot of it has to do with the crisis of sovereignty, and the crisis of sovereignty becoming much more intensified rather than ratified. And that crisis of sovereignty plays out in very different ways in South Asia, for example, in contemporary Pakistan, than it does perhaps in the context of the UK. But I think there is a certain way in which the more that sovereignty is in flux, the more there is a sense that one does not quite have control over the narrative of one's religious life or one's political sense of belonging, the more the question of situating sovereignty in the body of the Prophet becomes a matter of anxiety and a matter of contestation. So it's very interesting. Today, polemical chat rooms is one of the major sites where this debate is intensely debated and dissected and so on. And that's a question that I thought about. These very specific points are still subjects of tremendous anxiety and contestation. I think I would, rather than attributing this longevity to some kind of peculiar or idiosyncratic obsession or attachment, I think the more sort of philosophical speculation might be that there is a crisis of sovereignty that is becoming more and more intensified rather than ratified, and that then plays out in very different ways in, say, India or, say, Pakistan or the UK. But yeah, as I was saying, the UK audience is a very central audience for this book. And what I've really tried to show to those, ulama or non-ulama who are invested in this debate, as someone who's not from the ulama traditions, although from South Asia, but not from the ulama traditions, is that I think there is a lot to learn from this debate. And I think rather than the question of who won or who lost or who's right and who's wrong, which are important normative questions, I'm not undermining the significance of that question, but there is something to be really celebrated in the complexity of these debates and the original context of it, in which a very spirited debate was fought out, but no shots were fired. And I think that latter sort of insight is particularly germane in the South Asian context, but perhaps also in the UK context. So I'm speculating. I think I'm not exactly sure about the longevity. It's fascinating. It's a fascinating question.
Thank you.
Mizan, are you there? Okay, I'll take over if he's not there. I'm just going to look at who's got their hand up. Abdul Rahman Mustafa, I think you had your hand up for a while, so if I can just ask you to unmute yourself and ask the question.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you very much for the book. I had a question relating to something you mentioned in your talk, which was the appropriation of some of the ideas of Abu Ishaq al-Shatibi by the Deobandis in particular. So not directly related to the book perhaps, but to what extent do you think there is a potential within the idea of bid'ah as laid out by Shatibi and later appropriated by some Deobandis for a kind of indigenous form of Islamic secularism, right? In the sense that it calls for the division of the world between a religious and the non-religious, and insists that the two are almost oppositional categories which have to be kept separate, right? So that matters of dress, for example, must not be sanctified with a kind of religious sanctity. And on the other hand, matters of conventional human practice, custom, must not be allowed to traverse into the realm of religion proper. And in that sense, that kind of division, which has hitherto been thought to be indigenous to Protestantism or Christianity, and then sort of universalized, once we look at it through the kind of lens of political theology that you use so well in your book, might suggest that there are ways of, recovering those traditions from within a kind of indigenous discourse, right? So I mean, this isn't related to the book, which I thought was excellent, but perhaps just an invitation to think about that idea a little bit.
That's a really fascinating question. In some ways, Ibrahim al-Shatibi's idea that basically his definition of bid'ah as a practice, an innovated practice in religion that begins to simulate the Sharia in terms of the intensity with which it is adhered to. طريقة في الدين مخترعة تضاهي والشريعة. That I think is also central to the Deobandi Mastery and many other scholars, not just Deoband. I think it's a very standard sort of way of looking at bid'ah as these innovative practices that begin to simulate the obligations of Sharia and so on. But to this question of this distinction between, this anxiety to preserve the sanctity of these values of the Sharia and the obligations from the permissibles, does it then translate into some kind of a distinction of the religious and the secular? Two things I would say. And I think this connects to the point that Dr. Yahya was raising in the last question. On the one hand, yes, there is a correlation in the sense that it is really in the conditions of modernity that we see everyday practices and everyday life become such an intense theater of contestation. I might be incorrect on this, but my sense is, from what I've seen, in that we don't find this level of contestation or this level of interest in everyday practices like chess or kite flying or chicken fighting contests and so on and so forth that we see, or in terms of dress and what you do with your hair and so on, that we find from the early 19th century onwards, with a text like Taqwiyatul Iman of Shah Muhammad Ismail, and then the Durban School, this very important text by Maulana SherAli Tareen, Islah Rusum, and so on, which means rectifying conventions, rectifying rituals, and so on. So I think from that perspective, there is very much a relationship in that these new conditions of colonial modernity make everyday life the centerpiece of authenticity. So there I think there is a correlation. The reason why I would be perhaps a little circumspect about then mapping this argument to a religion-secular binary is that in my sort of reading of the category of secular and secularism, a very key component of it, as it has been expounded by scholars of anthropology like Talal Asad and Sabah Mahmood and so on, key to the idea of political secularism is the way in which the secular is mobilized by the modern state for the assemblage of its sovereignty. In that the distinction between the religious and the secular becomes a mechanism for the assemblage of modern state sovereignty, precisely by demarcating a sphere of life called religion that is then distinguished from something called the secular, which is the sphere of politics or the sphere of law. And this demarcation or the separation is oftentimes conducted in a way that amplifies and secures the sovereignty of the modern state. So for that reason, I might be a bit circumspect about thinking about these religious debates in the 14th century or even in the 19th century as a religious secular binary. But clearly there is something at work in that the new conditions of colonial modernity certainly do make everyday life much more of a centerpiece of contestation and debate.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Saiful Hadi to come on. If you've got a question, you've got your hand raised. If you can unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Yeah, done.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for a wonderful book. As you're aware, I do have some comments on it, but the one thing that I'd just like to focus on for this discussion is I'd like to know your ideas on how you think the ashraf versus ajlaf concept actually plays out in this particular dimension, especially since, as you're aware, that the ulama used to primarily not just be from, but engage with ashraf circles. And one of the unique features of Shah Muhammad Ismail is that he traveled throughout various different parts of India and stayed at local mosques in small villages and towns and had direct access to grassroots perspectives, which, for example, Maulana Fazl al-Khairabadi, or for that matter, even Shah Abdul Aziz, may not have had. So what do you think that, that this particular dimension, does it add any value to how you've imagined the context of Shah Ismail and Fazl al-Khairabadi's debates? And the other is that I'm quite curious to know that why political theology as a theoretical framework that you found to be the right one to explain this context, especially since that, and I know that, you haven't limited the political to just state structures, but actually a much wider definition of power dynamics and the relationship between scholars and the community, but also how does the bidirectionality of not just the theological involving the political, as Carl Schmitt puts it, but the political informing the theological, the other side, flipping it over. Okay. So why specifically this particular model? Because if you apply it to some of the other important actors in 19th century North India during that time, especially Shah Muhammad Ishaq, for example, who has 2 books on this specific subject, Mi'atu Masail and Masail Arba'in, and his interlocutor was the elder brother of Shah Abdul Ghani. In other debates, perhaps, it plays out differently. Their political imaginary is different from how you have found it between the debates of Shah Ismail and Maulana Fazl al-Haq. So any thoughts on that as well, that why specifically political theology? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maulana Saifullah Sahab. And I should say that I've really benefited a lot from Maulana Saifullah about in terms of his engagement and critiques of this book, and mashallah, he's a really brilliant scholar. Yeah, the first question, I think that's a very important point, and that the 2 points. One is that this is very much an elite debate and contestation. So hence, one cannot look at this as some kind of a debate between populists and elitists when it comes to the debate. It's very much an elite-driven conversation. And Shah Muhammad Ismail is peculiar precisely for that reason, in terms of going out to the public, in terms of the kind of public sort of reform that he does. Your question reminded me of a very interesting narrative that I also narrate in the book, which actually deals with Maulana Shah Muhammad Ishaq Dehlvi, in that, I mentioned that there is a story that is narrated that Maulana Shah Muhammad Ismail once goes to this very prominent brothel in Delhi, which was occupied by this really famous woman called Moti. And he goes there, and I won't tell the whole story, but eventually he recites the Quran, and she becomes very remorseful, and they basically that's one of the theaters of his reform that takes place, and he sort of reforms the people gathered there, the elite and the aristocrats, and Moti herself also becomes very remorseful, and they sort of destroy the drums and so on. And when he's coming back on the staircase of the Jamia Mosque, he's confronted by Shah Muhammad Ishaq Dehlvi, who says to him that, what are you doing to the reputation of your family? You come from a family of such great esteemed scholars and so on, and you're going to these sort of brothel houses and so on. To which Shah Muhammad Ismail iconically responds to him that, I'm surprised at what you're saying, Maulana. I will only be satisfied the day that, people will mount me on a donkey and I'll go around Chandni Chowk in Delhi, and I will be saying, God said such and such, and God's prophet said such and such. So the idea that I have to go to the public to reform them, there is this kind of a push. There is this kind of a push in which you have to go to the public in order to reform them, that I think does distinguish him from some of the other scholars, and that becomes the subject of quite a bit of interesting tension, as you know, within the family also, or his position on the whole question of Raf'al Yadayn and so on. So I think that's something very interesting that is to be captured. But then the same Shah Muhammad Ismail, of course, is capable and produces some really dense, sophisticated texts also when it comes to Sufism, when it comes to political theory, Mansab Imamat, and so on. So I try to capture both sides of this very intriguing personality. To your second question about political theology, my attempt in this book was that before I get to why this model and not some other model, the category of political theology, as many listeners would know, in religious studies, in the study of critical secularism studies for the last couple of decades or so, has primarily been employed to try to look at the theological foundations of liberal secular politics, the theological foundations of the modern state. With this resuscitation that we see of the theorist of law and philosopher Carl Schmitt, who famously, of course, wrote almost exactly a century ago that all modern political concepts are secularized theological concepts, especially the modern state. So what I try to do, as you mentioned here, Maulana Saifullah, that I try to invert that problem space by looking at the political projects and imaginaries at work in seemingly theological debates and disputes to do with things like Shafa'a and Bid'ah and so on and so forth. But yes, I think I should add the corrective that this particular model was useful for me to make sense of what was happening, for example, in texts of Maulana Kharabadi and Shah Muhammad Ismail, when they were using these imageries of the Mughal court. For example, when they talk about intercession, this idea that, the people, on the Day of Judgment, people will go through the files of the sinners and all that, and how that will be decided which sinner is then goes to heaven and otherwise and so on. So this constant use of the language of Mughal bureaucracy and so on. So there was clearly some kind of a political imaginary at work in terms of the theological stakes of this debate. To come back to the question that was asked earlier, the first question that was asked about the spiritual hierarchy. So clearly there is a political imaginary at work in terms of how these scholars think about the relationship between God, the prophet, and the community. So to capture that syncopation of the political and the theological seemed to me to be a useful way of capturing and to complicating this seemingly theological debate by connecting it to its larger political imaginary, which is not articulated as such, but can be discerned from the way in which the debate unfolds and in terms of its discourses. Now, adding your caveat, I think is important that perhaps this model of political theology is only workable, is only useful, is only perhaps conceptually profitable in the context of these particular actors and this particular debate and context. It may not work as well even in terms of other actors in South Asia, and that's completely fine. So I'm not arguing for the universal purchase or the universal applicability of this model, but for this particular context, it seemed to be doing some good work. And this theoretical model is not some kind of a scientific, social scientific idea that I am trying to come up with the cause of these debates, or this is what was happening in terms of its cause, but rather it's an exercise in theoretical playfulness that can have its limits. And there is a certain kind of a speculative dimension at work, which I'm very comfortable in admitting. But I think it does sort of do some work in terms of taking these debates out of their particular problem spaces and connecting them to larger problem spaces emanating from the Western humanities.
Thank you very much. There's another hand I can see up. It's Salman.
Yeah, I'm just going to unmute him.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. First of all, thank you for the session. It was very beneficial, and the book was wonderful. I just wanted to sort of build off of Dr. Asim Yusuf's question, in which you mentioned that a lot of the Deobandī ulama, when they were speaking about practices like the Mawlid and how the tradition reacted to the Mawlid, and many of the great ulama of the past permitted it, that they were actually prohibiting it based on a more contextual understanding of what was happening in North India. When I heard that, of course, one of the first things that came to my mind was a legal verdict given by Maulana Rashid Ahmad Gangohi, in which he was asked if there is a Mawlid in which there is no reprehensible actions, can we still participate in it? And he categorically said, even if it's free of reprehensible actions, one cannot go to such Mawlids. And at least from my minimal reading, what I found is that many of the Deobandī ulama tended to provide different justifications for prohibiting actions like the Mawlid and other of these cultural actions. Some of them adopted more of a Shatibian understanding of bid'ah, in which they would argue that there's no precedent for an action. Some of them would appeal to blocking the means or sadd al-dhari'a. And in that context, I just wanted to ask you how much of because you focused a lot on Maulana Tanwi and how he would say that these actions are in and of themselves permitted. And that reminds me of the letters that were exchanged between Maulana Gangohi and Maulana Tanwi on the understanding of bid'ah and on the best way to rectify the actions of the lay people. So I'm just wondering how much, and this applies to the Barelvī side as well, because I noticed that Dr. Asim Yusuf, for example, he said that the Barelvīs equal pretty much Ala Hazrat. And so my question was, how much of an intra-maslaki dispute do we find on these issues where people from within the circle of Maulana Gangohi or Maulana Tanwi or Maulana Khalid are actively debating these issues and perhaps coming to slightly different conclusions? And when does this, what we find today, this sort of this idea of a monolithic Deobandī identity pitted against a monolithic Barelvī viewpoint, this is not something that I think is found in the earlier generation of Deobandis. So how much of this intra-maslaki debate and back and forth do we find within the text? Is it minor? Is there a lot of dispute going on within these circles? And is it in the same fashion that we find what you mentioned regarding the relationship between the murshid and his murids, where there can be a level of disagreement that is allowed? So if you could just please expand on that.
Terrific question, Salman. Thank you so much for that. I think your question really is a very good reminder, and something that I do mention in the book, but I think it can be emphasized further here. That first of all, with both of these, let's call it streams of Muslim traditionalism in South Asia, they have multiple varieties. So, with the Durban School also, there is different kinds of scholars and so on. Of course, another important figure here is Maulana Muhammad Qasim Nanotwi, another founder of Deoband. He had a slightly different kind of temperament. So they're very different kinds of temperaments and scholars with both of these streams. And these individual scholars also, mashallah, they led long lives, and in their lives they did sort of change, or they had kind of different kind of points of emphasis at different moments in their lives. So that's a very important point to make, that there is no monolithic Deoband school, there is no monolithic quote unquote Barelvi maslak. Absolutely. And these intra sort of maslaki tensions, even when they might be very subtle and nuanced, in fact, let me rephrase it, precisely when they tend to be very nuanced and subtle is when they are extremely significant. And those the exchange of those letters, which because of the paucity of space, I was not really able to go into the details of that fascinating exchange and very dense exchange between Maulana Thanvi and Maulana Gangohi, really shows a very interesting moment of another kind of a master-disciple disagreement in a lot of etiquette, of course, but there is a different kind of temperament. Maulana Thanvi, of course, also goes through a slight shift over time in terms of his attitude towards these practices and so on. So yes, the intra-maslaki differences are significant precisely because they're so subtle. So I think the significance should not be measured in terms of the magnitude of difference, but the subtlety is precisely what is significant, and how they then negotiated that subtle difference, because it shows the multitude of the temperaments that populate this tradition. So yes, I fully endorse the point that you're making here, in that these intra-maslaki tensions and differences are really crucial to capture. And we see that even in the relationship between someone like Maulana Gangohi and Maulana Thanvi. Yeah, the other point that you made about Maulana Gangohi saying that even a gathering which, yeah, that actually I think relates to the kind of cautious hermeneutic that is at work in Deoband School. That, you know, even if there is a gathering in which there is no reprehensible activity, because of the possibility, because of the general sort of blocking the means even to the possibility of that kind of a corruption being generated. There is a certain kind of a cautiousness that we certainly see there that might be at work, but that might be a bit different from, say, Maulana Thanvi. So I think these intra-maslaki distinctions are very crucial, and that's what I tried to capture in the last chapter of the book, chapter 12.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we have to end it there. Otherwise, we can go on for a long, long time. I want to say thank you very much, first and foremost. Shukran to Dr. SherAli for giving his time. It was fascinating. There's so many more questions that I can ask myself. And I know people can get in touch with you, so I'm sure they will get in touch with you. Please do read the book. I've read the entire book a number of 2-3 times, and I've done some series on it as well, lectures on it as well. Please do read the book. It's a fantastic book. I'm sure it's going to be a game changer in terms of the academic study of this field, but also hopefully on the ground as well. So do engage with the book. Lots of conversations to be had, lots of nuances to be considered as well. And I would also like to thank Mizan for organizing all of this. I know it's hard work trying to get all these academics and scholars together to talk sometimes to each other, but it's important. So from myself, on behalf of everybody else as well who've joined and you've asked wonderful questions, I want to say Jazakallah, thank you to everybody. And Mizan, I think I'll hand it over to you and we'll end there, inshallah.
Thank you very much. It's time for biryani, right, Dr. SherAli and Maulana sir?
Thank you so much, Jazakallah, to all of you for your time. It's such your intellectual hospitality is so kind and dear. Thank you so much. And hope to continue the conversation, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Can I just say, Dr. SherAli, I think you need to take your book and sum it down into about 10 pages, because that's the only way it's going to be taken into consideration on the ground with the various communities. If it's possible to do that, please do so. Otherwise, no one who needs to read it is going to read it, I'm afraid.
There is also an argument to be made for patient reading in this age of iPhones and so on. So that's a very good suggestion, but I think let's see if the challenge is taken also. But I've tried to write in a way that it would make it accessible to non-specialists. So yeah.
Fantastic. Just want to remind everyone, with Pakistan and India Independence Days coming up in the next couple of weeks, we have an excellent session with Dr. Trisk on Aurangzeb. We have Jonathan Brown hosting that. We have Ruby Iqbal's Nur Jahan book as well. We're going to do a critical review of that. And we have a discussion with Salahuddin Iqbal Miyasab and Professor Iftikhar Malik on what would Iqbal think of Pakistan today. So we're going to be sending those, posting it up shortly, and please do join us for those sessions. And we'll also be starting some excellent Islamic in West Africa and East Africa series with some excellent professors and scholars from those regions. So watch out for this space, inshallah. Thank you so much. Take care and enjoy your biryanis. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakallah. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.